She was called the most beautiful woman in the world. Louis B. Mayer signed her to MGM after a single conversation. Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy competed for roles alongside her. A United States patent she co-filed in 1942 would eventually become one of the foundational technologies behind Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. She was also married 6 times, 6 different men, 6 different endings, and by the time her life was over, she was alone, reclusive, and largely forgotten by the industry that had made her a legend. What happened between all of that is a story about a woman who was too much of everything, too beautiful, too smart, too restless, for anyone she ever married to fully hold. This is the story of Hedy Lamarr's 6 husbands. Vienna and the making of Hedwig Kiesler. Before there was a Hedy Lamarr, there was a girl named Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler, born on November 9th, 1914, in Vienna, Austria, the only child of Emil Kiesler, a successful bank director, and Gertrude Lichtwitz Kiesler, an accomplished pianist who had grown up in Budapest. The Kieslers were a prosperous Jewish family living in one of the most culturally rich cities in Europe, and they gave their daughter everything that a comfortable Viennese upbringing in the 1920s could offer: private tutors, music lessons, wide reading, fluency in multiple languages, and the kind of intellectual atmosphere that makes a certain kind of mind expand rather than contract. Vienna between the wars was a city that took ideas seriously. Psychoanalysis, modern architecture, the philosophy of the Vienna Circle. And the Kiesler household was connected to enough of that world to give Hedwig a genuine early education. Emil Kiesler was particularly devoted to his daughter. He took her on long walks around Vienna, explaining how things worked, how a printing press functioned, how a tram's engine moved the car forward, how the mechanisms beneath everyday life were ordered and logical if you understood them correctly. Hedwig absorbed all of it with the focused attention of someone for whom understanding how things worked was not an obligation but a genuine pleasure. She had, from childhood, what her adult friends and colleagues would describe decades later as an engineer's mind, the instinct to look at any system and immediately begin thinking about what its weaknesses were and how they could be addressed. It was not a common quality in anyone. It was an especially uncommon quality in a young woman in the Austria of the 1920s and 1930s, where the educational and professional world had a very specific and limited idea of what a clever girl was supposed to do with her cleverness. She also had a face that stopped rooms. By her early teens, she was being noticed in Vienna for reasons that had nothing to do with her father's banking connections or her mother's musical accomplishments. She was tall and dark-haired, with a quality of physical presence that was immediately striking, and that the camera, when she finally encountered it, understood and reproduced with what seemed like enthusiasm. She discovered theatre at around 14 and began pursuing it with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. She found her way into the orbit of director Max Reinhardt, one of the most significant theatrical figures in German-language Europe, and studied with him in Berlin. At 17, she appeared in a small German film called Geld auf der Straße in 1930. Her first professional screen appearance, a minor role that nonetheless confirmed something she already suspected about herself. The camera was a place where the two things she had, the face and the mind, could work together rather than in competition. More parts followed through 1931 and 1932. She was building a career with deliberate speed, and by the time she was 18, she was already on a trajectory that could lead, for a young woman of her appearance and ambition in the Europe of the early 1930s, in one of two directions: a significant film career or a very significant marriage. In 1932, She received an offer to appear in a Czech film directed by Gustav Machati. The film was called Ecstasy. It would change everything, and not entirely in the ways she had anticipated. Ecstasy and the Consequences. Ecstasy was released in 1933 and caused a scandal that spread across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. The film included a scene of Hedwig Kiesler swimming without clothing, and another extended scene that generated considerable controversy regarding its content. The film was banned in multiple countries, condemned by the Catholic Church, and Adolf Hitler reportedly ordered all copies destroyed. Pope Pius XI also publicly condemned it. What it also did was put the face of Hedwig Kiesler on the front pages of newspapers across Europe, which brought her to the attention of a very specific and very powerful man who had been looking for a wife. Friedrich Mandl, known as Fritz, was 30 years old in 1933, significantly older than Hedwig, and he was one of the most formidable industrial figures in Austria. He owned the Hirtenberger Patronenfabrik, a munitions and weapons manufacturing company that made him one of the primary suppliers of ammunition to various European governments. His business connections extended to Benito Mussolini, to Austro-fascist political figures, and to the networks that were reshaping European power in the years before the Second World War. He was Catholic, despite having partial Jewish ancestry that he actively downplayed, and he moved with the confidence of a man who understood that in the Austria of the early 1930s, wealth and political connections were the only currencies that mattered. He pursued Hedwig Kiesler with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to acquiring things he wanted. He sent gifts, arranged introductions through mutual acquaintances, and was persistent in ways that the social structure of their world made it difficult for a 19-year-old actress to simply refuse. She was 19 when they married, on August 10th, 1933. He was 30. Her parents were not enthusiastic. Her father, Emil, was deeply uncomfortable with the match from the beginning, but they were in no practical position to prevent it. What followed was, by Hedwig's own detailed account in her 1966 autobiography Ecstasy and Me, a marriage that was spectacular on its surface and suffocating beneath it. Mandl was obsessive in his possessiveness. He attempted to purchase every existing print of Ecstasy, which he found intolerable given its content, spending significant sums on buying up copies he could destroy. When he discovered he couldn't buy them all, he turned his attention to controlling everything about his wife instead. She was not permitted to go out without him. She was not permitted to have friendships he hadn't pre-approved. She was watched by household staff. Her correspondence was monitored. He took her to his business dinners, where she sat at tables with arms dealers, fascist politicians, and military officials, listening to conversations that she had no formal training to understand, but that she absorbed with the particular attentiveness of someone with genuine curiosity about how things worked. She later said the dinners were educational. She was sitting in rooms where men were discussing torpedoes and radio-controlled guidance systems and the vulnerabilities of military communications technology. She was absorbing information about munitions and weapons manufacturing. She was paying attention in the way she had always paid attention, as someone for whom understanding a system was natural and automatic, and for whom the gap between the current state of something and an improved version was immediately visible. She was also increasingly afraid. Mandl's control had moved beyond restrictive into something closer to confinement. The warm, intellectually expansive girl who had walked the streets of Vienna with her father, discussing how machines worked, was now a possession kept in an extraordinary house, displayed at dinners, and prevented from having any meaningful independent life. She began, quietly and carefully, planning her escape. The escape. The precise details of how Hedwig Kiesler left Friedrich Mandl in 1937 have been told in different versions over the years, with the most dramatic involving her disguising herself as a maid to slip past the household staff who monitored her movements. Whether that specific detail is accurate or was embellished in various retellings, what is documented is that she did leave Austria, that she made her way to Paris and then to London, and that aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic, the Normandy, she found herself seated at dinner near Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful man in Hollywood. Mayer was traveling back to the United States after a European talent scouting expedition, doing what the major studios regularly did in that era, looking for European actors who could be polished and presented to American audiences. When he encountered Hedwig Kiesler at dinner and understood who she was, he made an offer. By her account, the initial offer was insulting, something in the range of $125 a week, a figure that bore no relationship to what she was worth or what she intended to accept. She went back to her cabin, thought carefully about who she wanted to be in America and what terms she was willing to work under, dressed with deliberate care, and returned to Mayer's table. By the time the ship reached New York, she had a contract that paid $500 a week with structured escalations that would take the figure significantly higher. She was 23 years old, and she had negotiated a studio contract aboard a transatlantic ocean liner with one of the most powerful executives in the entertainment industry. She had also secured a new name. Mayer suggested Lamarr, after the silent-era actress Barbara Lamarr, who had been called the most beautiful woman in the world. Hedwig Kiesler became Hedy Lamarr. The old name, and everything it carried, was left in the wake of the Normandy. She arrived in Hollywood in 1937, and within months was starring opposite Charles Boyer in Algiers, the film that introduced her to American audiences as something they had not quite seen before. She was not simply beautiful in the conventional Hollywood sense of the era. She had a quality of intelligence on screen, a watchfulness, a sense of active thought happening behind the eyes, that the camera captured and that audiences responded to with an immediacy that surprised even the studio. Reviews described her as magnetic, as hypnotic, as unlike anything currently working in American films. The studio had acquired something commercially extraordinary. It had also acquired something it had very little framework for understanding or managing. Because the thing about Hedy Lamarr, the thing that no studio system of that era had any real mechanism for accommodating, was that she was considerably more than the face they were marketing. Jean Markey and the Hollywood beginning. Her second husband was nothing like her first. Jean Markey was a screenwriter and producer who moved comfortably in the upper tier of Hollywood's social world. He was literate, witty, well-traveled, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made him interesting company without making him particularly deep. He had been previously married to actress Joan Bennett and, later, to actress Hedy's eventual contemporary Myrna Loy, which gave him a specific social credential in the Hollywood community of the late 1930s and a demonstrated pattern of being attracted to remarkable women. He and Hedy were married on March 4th, 1939, and the marriage had a glamorous surface entirely in keeping with the MGM star system's sense of how its leading people were supposed to live. The marriage lasted 2 years and was, by most accounts of those who observed it, more of a social arrangement than a genuine partnership. They were well matched at the level of dinner parties and industry events and the general performance of Hollywood coupledom in the studio era's golden age. Beneath the performance, the compatibility was considerably more limited. Markey was charming, and Hedy was extraordinary, and the combination worked at parties. But a party is not a marriage, and the daily life of their shared household did not sustain what the social life projected. Markey's infidelity was one reason the marriage collapsed. Hedy's restlessness was another. She was not, by any account of her character, someone who could maintain the performance of contentment when the reality underneath it was something else. She had spent 4 years performing contentment for Fritz Mandl, and she did not have another 4 years of that in her. During the marriage, they adopted a son named James. The circumstances of James's origins were not straightforward. He later claimed as an adult to be Hedy's biological child by a relationship outside the marriage, an assertion that complicated the family record and was never definitively resolved. Hedy never publicly confirmed the specific claim in full detail. What is perhaps more significant than the marriage itself was what Hedy was doing in the hours she was not performing for cameras or attending parties. She had installed a drafting table in her home. She had begun, systematically, to think through technical problems that interested her. She had never stopped being the girl who had listened to her father explain mechanisms. She had never stopped processing the information absorbed at Mandl's dinner tables, where the men who built weapons had talked about their limitations without ever imagining that the decorative young wife of their host was filing every technical detail away. In the early years of the Second World War, with German submarines threatening Allied shipping and the limitations of radio-controlled guidance systems becoming a military problem of genuine urgency, she had identified something that she believed could be fixed. The problem was simple to state. A radio signal sent to guide a weapon could be jammed by broadcasting on the same frequency and overwhelming the communication. If you knew what frequency the guidance signal was using, you could disrupt it. Her solution required frequency hopping, rapidly changing the frequency of the radio signal in a synchronized pattern between the transmitter and the receiver, so that both ends of the communication were always on the same frequency, even as that frequency changed dozens of times per second, making jamming effectively impossible. She developed the concept in conversation with her neighbor, George Antheil, a composer who had worked extensively with player piano rolls and who understood the mathematical problem of synchronizing two mechanical systems across time and distance. They filed a patent on August 11th, 1942. United States Patent 2,292,387 described what they called a secret communication system. The Navy declined to implement it during the war. The prevailing view was that the electronics required were too bulky for the weapons of the era. The patent expired in 1959. Hedy received no compensation. And then, as electronics miniaturized across the following decades, the technology she had conceived was adopted by military communication systems, then commercial systems, then the consumer electronics, that would eventually mean that virtually every wireless device on Earth was, in some technical sense, using principles she had described in a California kitchen during the Second World War. She received nothing for it during the decades when it generated the most value. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived late enough that it felt more like a correction than a reward. But in 1941, with the marriage to Markey dissolving and the patent 2 years away from filing, what she was thinking about most was the next chapter. John Loder and the children. Her third marriage was her longest and, in certain respects, her most consequential for the shape of the rest of her life. John Loder was a British actor, tall, classically handsome, with the easy manner of an English gentleman who had navigated Hollywood without losing his sense of who he was outside of it. He had appeared in a substantial number of films through the 1930s and 1940s without ever quite achieving major stardom, which placed him in a curious position relative to Hedy. He was a professional peer in category, but not in scale, a working actor sharing a household with one of the most recognizable women in the world. They married on May 27, 1943, after Hedy's short-lived involvement with Markey had concluded and the patent had been filed. The marriage lasted 4 years. The children were the most significant product of the union. Denise Hedwig Loder was born in 1945, and Anthony John Loder arrived in 1947. The same year the marriage ended, which tells you something about the internal chronology of how things were going. Anthony has spoken, in various interviews over the decades, about his mother, with a combination of genuine love and honest complexity. He described a woman who was brilliant, beautiful, and often elsewhere, not absent in the simple sense, but present in ways that were oriented towards something other than the daily rhythms of raising children. The household was maintained by staff. Hedy's career was maintained by MGM. The connection between mother and children was real, but conducted often through layers of practical mediation. The divorce was finalized in 1947. Loder's accounts of the marriage, given in subsequent years, described a man who had been genuinely in love with someone he could never quite reach. Someone whose attention was always, on some level, somewhere else. The children, the household, the professional life, all of it was present. But Hedy's interior world was operating on its own schedule, one that the domestic arrangements of married life could not fully contain. Loder went on to live a quieter life in England after the marriage ended. He and Hedy did not maintain a close relationship. The career was also beginning to show the first signs of the slowdown that would define the 1950s. She had made significant films through the mid-1940s, Tortilla Flat in 1942, The Heavenly Body in 1944, The Strange Woman in 1946, and she would make one of her best-remembered appearances as Delilah in Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah in 1949. But the particular kind of European glamour she embodied was becoming familiar rather than fresh. She had turned down roles she would later regret. The film Gaslight was offered to her before it went to Ingrid Bergman. Strategic decisions made at the peak of her commercial appeal did not serve her as well as she had hoped when the peak was behind her. She was 32 years old in 1947. She had 3 children. She had 3 divorces. She had a patent sitting unimplemented in Washington. 3 more marriages remained, and the longest was still ahead. Teddy Stauffer and the Brief Swiss Interlude. Teddy Stauffer was, in almost every measurable way, the least significant of Hedy Lamarr's 6 marriages, least significant in duration, in legacy, and in the extent to which it seems to have mattered deeply to either party involved. He was a Swiss musician and former bandleader who had built a second career as a hotel and nightclub owner in Acapulco, Mexico, where he had become a significant figure in the expatriate social scene that flourished in the town during the late 1940s and early 1950s. He was known in those circles for his charm, his easy social manner, and his ability to move between worlds without apparent difficulty. He was the kind of person who seems more interesting in a bar overlooking the Pacific than he turns out to be in a marriage. They married in 1951. They divorced in 1952. The marriage lasted approximately 10 months, produced no children, and left very little documentation of what occurred between them. In the limited interviews Hedy gave about her marriages over the years, the Stauffer chapter was mentioned with the brevity it probably deserved, a connection that had seemed to promise something and delivered considerably less. She had been in her mid-30s, between careers and between husbands, and Stauffer had been in the vicinity and had seemed appealing in the way that things sometimes seem appealing when you are between things. What the Stauffer marriage does represent, in the broader arc of her story, is a pattern that had by now become visible to observers, even if Hedy herself could not always see it from inside. She moved toward commitment quickly and away from it almost as quickly, engaged each new relationship with what appears to have been genuine hope, and discovered, with each one, that the particular combination of needs and expectations she carried was one that no man she encountered could sustain over time. She was 40 years old as the Stauffer marriage dissolved. She had been famous for over a decade. She had 3 children in various arrangements of care. She had a patent sitting on a shelf in Washington that nobody was doing anything with. She had 4 marriages behind her, and the money from MGM was not as abundant as it had been. She was also still, by every account of those who saw her in person, startlingly beautiful. Her 5th husband would be the one who lasted the longest. W. Howard Lee and the longest chapter. William Howard Lee was a Texas oil executive, prosperous, grounded, and possessed of the steady certainty that comes from building something real in an industry that rewards patience and practical intelligence. He was not a glamour figure. He did not have ambitions in the entertainment industry, and no interest in being absorbed by the demands of Hedy's career. He was not a particularly complicated man, and after the accumulated complications of her first 4 marriages, this was apparently appealing. He was, in the terms of what she appeared to need at that particular moment, a stable and substantial presence who could provide the financial and emotional security that the previous 5 marriages had not sustained for long. They married on December 22nd, 1953, and the marriage lasted until 1960, 7 years, which by the standards of her personal history was an almost remarkable length of time. The Texas oil money was real, the stability it offered was genuine, and for a period, Hedy stepped back from the relentless public exposure of her Hollywood peak years. She was still recognizable and still sought after for public appearances, but the frantic energy of the MGM era had given way to something quieter. She and Lee split their time between Texas and California. She appeared less often in major productions. The specific commercial pressure of being a leading MGM actress was lifting. She was also, through these years, continuing to think and to invent. She had ideas, multiple ideas, pursued with varying levels of rigor, that she would sometimes sketch out in notebooks and sometimes develop further with engineers and designers she encountered at social gatherings. She conceived a fluorescent dog collar to make pets visible at night. She worked on a modified traffic light system. She had ideas about tablet-based carbonation for drinks that preceded similar commercial concepts by years. Whether any of these would have produced significant results if pursued with the discipline she had applied to the frequency hopping patent is impossible to know. But what they demonstrate is that the mind was always active, always looking for the next problem worth solving, always restless in a way that no external circumstance of her life had ever fully contained. The Lee marriage ended in 1960. The specific reasons were never publicly detailed, which itself suggests they were ordinary rather than dramatic. She was 45 years old, had been married 5 times, and was approaching the final chapters of her Hollywood career with the particular combination of resources and regrets that a life of her scale tends to produce. Her financial situation had become increasingly precarious. The habits of living she considered appropriate were expensive, and her career was no longer generating income at anywhere near the rate of her peak years. One more marriage remained. Louis Boies and the final attempt. Louis J. Boies was a lawyer from New York. He and Hedy Lamarr married in 1963, when she was 48 years old. The marriage lasted 2 years and ended in 1965. She sued him for divorce on the grounds that he was more interested in her fame and connections than in her as a person. A complaint that, given her 30 years of accumulated experience, carried its own particular weight. The Boies' marriage coincided with the period of Hedy's autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, which was published in 1966. The book was written with the assistance of ghostwriters, and its contents were considerably more explicit and personal than she had anticipated, or so she maintained after publication. She sued her co-authors and the publisher for what she said was a misrepresentation of the material and of her involvement in the final text. The lawsuit was eventually settled, but the episode added to the general turbulence of a period that was becoming increasingly difficult in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She also sued director Mel Brooks in 1974 for including a character named Hedy Lamarr in his Western comedy Blazing Saddles without her permission or compensation. The case was settled out of court. She reportedly accepted the settlement with a dry remark about what Brooks should have paid her, which was entirely in character. The shoplifting incidents that generated press coverage in 1966 and 1991 need to be understood in the context of a woman whose financial situation had deteriorated significantly from the heights of her studio years and whose relationship with the public world had become increasingly fraught. The 1966 arrest at a Los Angeles department store was eventually dropped. The 1991 incident in Florida, when she was 76 years old, was similarly disposed of without conviction. But both were covered with a prurience that said more about how the media treated women who had once been celebrated than it said about anything factually significant. She was, in her final decades, living inside the gap between who she actually was and who the world had decided she had been. These incidents, the shoplifting, the lawsuit, the public humiliations of a career in full retreat, need to be understood in the context of the specific and documented problem of cosmetic surgery. Hedy had begun having procedures done in the 1950s and 1960s, and by the late 1960s and 1970s, the accumulated results had begun to distort rather than preserve. She became increasingly unwilling to be photographed, increasingly reclusive, increasingly protective of the privacy that had once been impossible for her to maintain. The beauty that had been both her greatest asset and her most complicated burden was now the thing she was hiding. The last years and what was finally recognized. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, Hedy Lamarr had retreated from public life almost entirely. She lived in apartments in New York and then in Florida, kept to herself, communicated primarily by telephone, and maintained a small circle of contacts rather than the vast social world she had once inhabited. The beauty that had been both her greatest asset and her most complicated burden had become, in the final decades of her life, a source of acute anxiety rather than confidence. She had begun having cosmetic procedures done in the 1950s and 1960s, and by the late 1960s and 1970s, the accumulated results had begun to distort rather than preserve. She became increasingly unwilling to be photographed, increasingly reclusive, increasingly protective of a privacy that had once been almost impossible for her to maintain. She wore enormous sunglasses in public on the rare occasions she appeared. She cancelled interviews that had been arranged. She preferred the telephone to any situation where her appearance was visible. She developed a close friendship with her son, Anthony Loder, who visited her regularly and became one of the most consistent presences in her final years. He later described those visits with evident affection. A mother who was still sharp, still curious, still capable of conversation that ranged across subjects with genuine speed and intelligence. The mind had not diminished. The restlessness had not diminished. What had changed was her relationship with the world that had always looked at her and seen primarily a face. She occasionally gave telephone interviews, a format she preferred precisely because it did not require her to be visible. In one such interview, she talked about her invention with a combination of pride and bitterness that was entirely warranted. She had conceived what became a foundational wireless communications technology The Navy had taken it up and used it. The commercial world had taken it up and generated enormous value from it. She had received, across those decades, essentially nothing. The shoplifting incidents that generated press coverage in 1966 and again in 1991 were reported with a prurience that said more about how the media treated women who had once been famous than it said about anything factually significant. The 1966 arrest at a May Company department store in Los Angeles on suspicion of stealing merchandise worth roughly $86 was eventually dropped. The 1991 incident at a drugstore in Florida when she was 76 years old was similarly disposed of without conviction. But the coverage both times had the quality of a public shaming, of a tabloid industry that found something satisfying about a fallen icon being escorted through a booking process. The Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her its Pioneer Award in 1997. She was 82 years old and accepted by telephone. The citation described what she had contributed to modern communications technology: the spread spectrum principles, the frequency hopping, the secure communications that her patent had anticipated by decades. She said, in the brief conversation, that she was pleased someone had finally noticed. Hedy Lamarr died on January 19, 2000, at her home in Castleberry, Florida. She was 85 years old. She was alone, no husband, no regular companion, the children present in her life, but not under the same roof. She had requested that her ashes be scattered in the Vienna woods. A return, at the end, to the city where Emil Kiesler had walked his daughter through the streets, explaining how the world worked before any of it had happened. Anthony Loder carried out her wish. He took her ashes to Austria and returned them to the woods she had asked for. The girl from Vienna, who had become the most beautiful woman in the world and one of the uncredited architects of modern wireless technology, went back to where she had started. The city of Vienna officially honored her in 2014, naming a section of street after her, Hedy Lamarr Gasse, in the district of Turbulent. She had been dead for 14 years by the time her city formally acknowledged what she had been. What the 6 marriages meant. 6 marriages, 1 patent that changed the world, 3 children raised in varying configurations of presence and distance, a career that burned at its brightest between 1938 and 1949, and then faded as the studio system that had created it shifted toward different kinds of beauty and different kinds of stories. A final quarter-century of increasing retreat. And then, at the very end, recognition that arrived almost too late to feel like much more than a correction of a long oversight. What the marriages of Hedy Lamarr tell us, across the full arc of the story, is something about the specific difficulty of being a person who cannot be contained by the categories available. She was beautiful, and the world of her era had a fully developed system for processing beautiful women. They married wealth, or they became film stars, or ideally both. They were photographed and managed and scheduled and packaged. The system was not designed to accommodate the simultaneous fact of genuine technical invention, of an engineer's mind operating alongside the actress's face, of a restless intelligence that found every domestic arrangement eventually insufficient. The studios understood what to do with her face. They did not understand what to do with the rest of her. Each husband encountered a different facet of who she was, and found it, in its own way, too much to hold. Fritz Mandl tried to possess her, and found it was not possible. She was observant enough at his dinner tables to understand weapons systems she had no formal training for, and determined enough to plan and execute an escape from a life that was destroying her. He had thought he was acquiring something manageable. He was not. Jean Markey charmed her and did not hold her attention long enough to understand what she was actually thinking about at the drafting table she had installed in her house. John Loder gave her children and a home, and could not give her whatever she was still looking for, the specific thing she needed from a partner that none of the six managed to fully provide. Teddy Stauffer was a pleasant detour that lasted 10 months and left very little trace. Howard Lee gave her stability for 7 years. Before that, 2 proved insufficient in ways that neither of them apparently articulated clearly enough to fix. Louis Boies gave her 2 years before she concluded he was interested in what she represented rather than in who she was. She was, through all 6 marriages, fundamentally the same person. Too curious to be comfortable, too restless to be satisfied, too aware of her own intelligence to pretend that any arrangement that did not honor it was one she could sustain for very long. The patent, which she received no money from and which is now embedded in technologies worth hundreds of billions of dollars in commercial value, is the clearest single image of what her life actually meant beyond the marriages and the films. She had sat at a weapons manufacturer's dinner table as a teenager in Vienna, listened carefully to conversations she was not supposed to understand, and spent the following decade quietly working out a better solution to a problem the military establishment had not solved. She had filed the patent. She had been ignored. The technology had been used anyway. The money had gone elsewhere. And 50 years later, every time anyone connects a device wirelessly, they are in some sense using a principle she thought of first in a California house during a marriage that lasted 2 years. She was married 6 times and received the most significant recognition of her actual contributions by telephone at the age of 82. She gave her best idea to a world that didn't compensate her for it, and she continued to have ideas anyway, until the end. That is the story of Hedy Lamarr's 6 marriages, and the woman those marriages could never quite contain. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.